Imagine a hammer striking iron on a hot Virginia morning. Sparks fly, metal bends, and with every blow, a new shape takes form. In 1800, that hammer belonged to Gabriel, a towering enslaved blacksmith whose skill made him indispensable to his enslaver and whose mind made him dangerous to the entire slave-holding South. Gabriel was not content to remain in chains. From the fire of his forge, he envisioned something radical, an uprising that would shatter the foundations of slavery in Virginia. His plan was bold, almost unthinkable for its time. Hundreds of enslaved men would march on Richmond, seize weapons, capture leaders, and demand freedom. This was no spontaneous riot. It was a carefully crafted revolution led by a man who refused to accept bondage as his destiny. But revolutions, especially in a world built on surveillance and fear, are fragile. Betrayal, storms, and paranoia would conspire to crush Gabriel's dream before it could ignite. Yet the mere existence of his plan terrified Virginia's elite, exposing the cracks in a system that claimed to be unshakable. This is not just the story of a failed rebellion. It is the story of how one man's vision of liberty revealed the deep fear hiding behind slavery's facade of power. Gabriel's rebellion reminds us that even the mightiest systems tremble when the oppressed dare to imagine freedom. Welcome to Dark History, Gabriel's Rebellion. 1800, the blacksmith who planned revolution. At the turn of the 19th century, Virginia stood as both the cradle of American independence and the prison of its greatest contradiction. The revolution had promised liberty, but its soil remained soaked with the sweat of the enslaved. Wealthy planters toasted freedom in halls built by people who knew only chains. Richmond, the young state capital, was a city in transition. Its population swelled with merchants, politicians, and artisans, but enslaved laborers were the invisible backbone. They dug trenches, hauled stone, and forged iron, building the same republic that excluded them from its promises. The city wore liberty like a mask. The plantation countryside told the same story. Tobacco fields rolled across hills, draining both the land and the lives of those forced to work them. Wheat had joined tobacco as Virginia's cash crop, but the profits still flowed from enslaved hands. Families were torn apart as human beings were traded alongside cattle and grain. The ideology of freedom clashed daily with the reality of bondage. Virginia's leaders, men like Jefferson and Madison, spoke of natural rights while holding hundreds in captivity. The hypocrisy was glaring, yet deeply normalized. Slavery was not just an economic system. It was woven into law, religion, and culture. Yet beneath this apparent stability lurked unease. The Haitian Revolution, which began in 1791, had shocked the world. In the only successful slave revolt in history, the enslaved had risen up, defeated Napoleon's forces, and established a free black republic. Its echoes traveled across oceans and rivers, straight into the ears of enslaved Virginians. For white Virginians, Haiti was a nightmare. It proved that the enslaved were not passive, not content, and not powerless. Fear of another Haiti haunted every tavern, every legislative hall, every whispered conversation among the planter elite. It was the shadow that followed every claim of order. For the enslaved, Haiti was hope. Stories of Toussaint Louverture and the Haitian rebels spread in fragments through sailors, travelers, and secret word of mouth. Even without books, the message was clear. Slavery could be broken and freedom was possible. If it could happen on an island, why not in Virginia? The laws reflected the paranoia of the ruling class. Enslaved people were forbidden from learning to read, gathering in groups, or traveling without permission. The fear was not of crime, but of knowledge. Words, ideas, and solidarity were more threatening than swords. Controlling the mind was as important as chaining the body. Daily life carried these contradictions. Enslaved men and women toiled from sunrise to sunset, but within their cabins, they carved moments of humanity. Families gathered around fires, songs were sung, stories were told, and prayers whispered. Each act of survival was an act of resistance, even when hidden from sight. Religion became both tool and weapon. White preachers thundered sermons about obedience, twisting scripture to serve slavery. But enslaved congregations read the same Bible differently. In Exodus, they saw themselves. Pharaoh was not ancient Egypt. Pharaoh was Virginia. Deliverance was not just spiritual, it was a promise of real liberation. The city of Richmond itself, became a crucible of tension. Free black artisans lived alongside enslaved laborers, blurring the lines between bondage and autonomy. Markets bustled with both groups, exchanging not just goods but also ideas. The presence of free black men was proof that freedom could exist, and that made them dangerous in the eyes of slaveholders. Fear was the silent partner in every transaction. White elites drilled militias, passed stricter codes, and clung to their illusions of security. Yet they knew the truth. Their wealth stood on unstable ground. Every enslaved worker was also a potential rebel. Every hammer, every plow, every axe could become a weapon if turned in defiance. It was in this tense world, half fortress, half powder keg, that Gabriel lived. A blacksmith by trade, he was part of the skilled labor that kept both city and plantation running. His forge became more than a workshop. It was a place where sparks flew not just from iron, but from the imagination of freedom. Gabriel's towering frame and keen intellect made him stand out, even among the enslaved. His craft earned him respect from both enslaved and free, but respect was a dangerous currency. The very qualities that made him valuable as a blacksmith also made him a threat in the eyes of the masters. Strength and intelligence in bondage were always suspect. Virginia in 1800 was a land of contradictions, hypocrisy, and fear. It celebrated liberty while enforcing slavery. It feared rebellion while creating the conditions for revolt. And into this contradiction walked Gabriel, a man who believed the chains of his time could be bent and broken, just like the iron he hammered on his anvil. Gabriel was born into slavery around 1776, the very year America declared independence. While white revolutionaries celebrated liberty or death, Gabriel entered a world where his liberty was denied at birth. That contradiction would shape his destiny. He was enslaved on the Brookfield plantation, owned by Thomas Prosser near Richmond, Virginia. The Prosser estate was large and wealthy, relying on the forced labor of dozens of enslaved men, women, and children. Gabriel grew up surrounded by the rhythm of bondage, work, punishment, survival. Yet, even within this cage, Gabriel stood out. He was tall, strong, and striking, with a commanding presence that others noticed. His physical stature alone gave him authority, but it was his mind that set him apart. He listened, learned, and absorbed everything around him. Unlike many enslaved people forced into field labor, Gabriel was trained as a blacksmith. Blacksmiths were among the most valued artisans in early America. They shaped tools, repaired wagons, built farming equipment, and forged the weapons of daily life. This skill gave Gabriel a unique position. The forge became his classroom and his stage. Sparks danced as he hammered iron into plowshares, horseshoes, and hinges. The sound of metal striking metal echoed like a drumbeat of defiance. Each strike reminded him that even the hardest iron could be bent with enough fire and force. His craft brought him into contact with both enslaved and free communities. Blacksmiths often traveled, working on neighboring farms or in Richmond itself. These journeys exposed Gabriel to new ideas, rumors of rebellion, whispers of freedom, and even the radical language of revolution carried by sailors and travelers. Gabriel's literacy is debated, but he was certainly informed. He listened to sermons, speeches, and conversations with a sharp ear. He heard the words of the Bible and twisted them into weapons of liberation. Exodus was not just scripture, it was a blueprint for uprising. His skill gave him a degree of trust, though trust in slavery was always conditional. The Prossers depended on him to keep their tools sharp and their equipment intact. But dependency is a double-edged sword. The more valuable Gabriel became, the more dangerous he was in their eyes. Inside the forge, Gabriel learned more than metalwork. He learned discipline, patience, and vision. To mold iron, a smith must imagine the shape before it exists. Gabriel began to apply the same logic to society. If chains could be broken on the anvil, why not the chains of slavery itself? Other enslaved men looked up to him, drawn by his strength and confidence. In whispered conversations, Gabriel became more than a craftsman. He became a leader. His hammering was not just labor, it was inspiration, each strike a promise that the world could be reshaped. The forge also gave him a language of power, fire, metal, and force, all symbols of transformation. Just as a blade was drawn from raw iron, so too could freedom be forged from the raw material of courage. Gabriel's mind and his forge were one. both places where impossible dreams took form. By the late 1790s, Gabriel was no longer just an enslaved artisan. He was a man quietly preparing for something larger. His skill at the forge had sharpened more than his tools. It had sharpened his vision, and that vision pointed toward rebellion. Rebellion does not begin in a single moment. It builds slowly, like pressure beneath the earth before a quake. For Gabriel, the seeds of revolt were planted by history itself, watered by whispers of freedom, and sharpened by the hypocrisy surrounding him. One of the greatest influences was the American Revolution. Though Gabriel had been born into slavery during that era, its slogans never disappeared. He heard the words repeated often: liberty, rights, independence. The irony was inescapable. White Virginians had fought a war to free themselves from tyranny while keeping others in bondage. Gabriel knew those words by heart. They were painted on banners, echoed in sermons, and etched into the nation's founding documents. But he also knew their limits. The liberty celebrated on July 4th was not meant for him or for those who looked like him. The hypocrisy burned hotter than his forge. Another influence was the Haitian Revolution, the most shocking event of the late 18th century. Beginning in 1791, enslaved people in Saint-Domingue rose up against French rule, crushed armies, and built the independent nation of Haiti. By 1800, the news had traveled across the Atlantic, shaking slave societies everywhere. For Virginia's enslaved, Haiti was proof that freedom was not just a dream. It was achievable. If Toussaint Louverture and his fighters could topple France's empire, why couldn't Gabriel and his allies topple Virginia's masters? The example was terrifying for the planners, but electrifying for the enslaved. Sailors brought rumors into Richmond's docks. Newspapers printed fearful stories about black Jacobins and their victories. Even when filtered through white panic, the message was clear. Enslaved people could rise, fight, and win. For Gabriel, Haiti was not a distant event. It was a roadmap. Closer to home, Gabriel drew strength from religion. In the African Methodist Episcopal Church and in private gatherings, enslaved people studied the Bible in ways their enslavers never intended. They found inspiration in stories of deliverance: Moses confronting Pharaoh, Daniel defying kings, Christ overturning tables. To slaveholders, the Bible was a tool of obedience. To Gabriel, it was a declaration of resistance. When he heard preachers thunder about "let my people go," he did not imagine spiritual release. He imagined chains broken in Richmond. Faith became fuel for fire. Personal injustice also deepened his resolve. He saw families torn apart on the auction block, mothers separated from children, husbands from wives. The cruelty was not abstract, it was daily life. Each act of violence added weight to his conviction that slavery could never be reformed. It had to be destroyed. Gabriel's own status as a skilled blacksmith gave him unusual mobility. He moved between plantation and city, between fields and workshops. This movement allowed him to hear more conversations, gather more information, and quietly build a network that others could not. In taverns and streets, he overheard political debates, the rise of democratic ideals, the influence of the French Revolution, and the constant talk of liberty shaped his thinking. If equality was truly universal, why should color or bondage deny it? Gabriel's questions were dangerous but logical. Among his peers, Gabriel began to speak with conviction. He reminded them of Haiti, of Moses, of freedom written in America's own Declaration of Independence. His words were careful but powerful. In every whisper, he planted a seed that liberty was not impossible. It was overdue. By 1800, these seeds had grown into conviction. Gabriel no longer saw himself only as a blacksmith, but as a leader chosen by history. The sparks of rebellion were everywhere, in sermons, in rumors, in contradictions. All they needed was someone to forge them into a single flame. Gabriel believed he was that man. Every rebellion needs more than anger. It needs vision, strategy, and daring. Gabriel was not reckless, he was deliberate. Like a blacksmith shaping iron, he hammered his ideas into a plan bold enough to terrify Virginia's rulers. The foundation of his plan was simple but radical: strike at the very heart of Virginia's power. Richmond, the state capital, was not just a city. It was the symbol of authority, wealth, and government. To take Richmond was to challenge slavery itself at its core. Gabriel envisioned hundreds, perhaps thousands of enslaved men marching into the city. They would overwhelm Richmond's defenses, seize weapons, and hold leaders hostage. The governor himself would be forced to confront the reality that the enslaved were no longer silent. The plan was not blind violence. Gabriel wanted to make a statement as much as he wanted to win. His intention was to demand freedom, not slaughter. Property might be destroyed, but the aim was political transformation. He wanted emancipation, not chaos. Organization was key. Gabriel quietly recruited trusted men from plantations and workshops. Meetings were held in secrecy, often at night, sometimes in fields, sometimes in cabins. Each conversation was cautious, each word weighed. Betrayal was always a danger. He built his network through respect. Gabriel's stature as a skilled blacksmith gave him authority, and his eloquence gave him influence. When he spoke of liberty, others listened. His confidence spread, convincing many that change was possible, even inevitable. Weapons were essential. Enslaved men gathered swords, axes, clubs, and farm tools that could double as arms. Rumors suggested some planned to steal muskets from armories. Every tool of labor became a potential instrument of revolution. Communication relied on subtlety. Messages were whispered, disguised as ordinary talk, hidden in work songs or biblical language. A phrase about crossing over could mean liberation. A mention of the storm coming could signal the uprising. It was a code born of necessity. Gabriel's plan also contained a symbolic edge. According to some accounts, he intended to spare certain groups, including poor whites and Frenchmen, seeing them as fellow oppressed or potential allies. His vision was not simply racial revenge. It was broader, a call for solidarity among the downtrodden. Timing mattered. Gabriel chose the summer of 1800 when tobacco harvests were in full swing and planters were distracted. He calculated that surprise in numbers would overwhelm the unprepared militia. It was bold, but boldness was the only chance. In Gabriel's mind, the rebellion would not end in Richmond. Once the city fell, the news would spread. Other enslaved communities across Virginia, and perhaps beyond, might rise in solidarity. What began as one city's uprising could ignite a wider revolution. The dream was enormous, but it was not fantasy. Haiti had proved the impossible was possible. America's own revolution had shown that ordinary men could defeat an empire. Gabriel was following a pattern already carved by history, only this time, the oppressed would be the victors. But like any plan, Gabriel's was vulnerable. It relied on secrecy, unity, and timing, all fragile in a society built on surveillance and betrayal. A single whisper, a single storm could unravel everything. Yet Gabriel pressed on, convinced that freedom was worth the risk. In the heat of Virginia's summer, the plan moved closer to action. Hammers struck iron in the forge, tools were sharpened, messages spread. For those who followed Gabriel, liberation felt closer than ever. The uprising was no longer a dream, it was imminent. History often turns on moments no one can predict. For Gabriel, the night of his rebellion was supposed to be the beginning of freedom. Instead, it became a story of fate, weather, and betrayal colliding to shatter a dream. The chosen date was August 30th, 1800. It was carefully selected after weeks of preparation. That evening, enslaved men from plantations surrounding Richmond were to gather under cover of night, armed with whatever weapons they could muster. From there, they would march into the city and strike. Excitement and tension hung heavy. For the conspirators, it was the night everything could change. They whispered prayers, clutched weapons, and imagined a dawn where they would no longer bow their heads in chains. For Gabriel, it was the moment his vision would be tested. But then came the storm. As dusk fell, Virginia's skies unleashed a torrent of rain. Thunder roared, lightning split the sky, and winds howled across the countryside. Roads turned to rivers, bridges washed away, and paths became impassable. The weather was no small inconvenience. It was a disaster. Men traveling from distant plantations could not reach the meeting points. Wagons overturned, rivers swelled, and gathering forces scattered in the chaos. Nature itself seemed to conspire against Gabriel's plan. Some conspirators took it as an omen. Perhaps God was intervening, some whispered, either to delay the rebellion or to warn them. Others were simply frustrated, knowing that timing was everything and the storm had stolen their chance for surprise. Gabriel himself was forced into a painful decision. With so many unable to assemble, the numbers were far smaller than expected. Attacking Richmond with a weakened force would mean certain defeat. He ordered a postponement, hoping to regroup and strike again. Yet, delay was dangerous. Every extra hour gave space for whispers to spread. Suspicion was already thick in Virginia, and the storm had not drowned out fear. Among the enslaved, loyalty was deep, but fear of punishment could be stronger than solidarity. 2 enslaved men, terrified of what might happen, betrayed the plot to their masters. Their confessions were hurried, uncertain, but enough to spark alarm. To white Virginians, even rumors of an uprising confirmed their worst fears. The authorities moved swiftly. Militia were mobilized, patrols sent out, and roads blocked. Richmond, which had been Gabriel's target, was suddenly bristling with armed defenders, expecting attack at any moment. The element of surprise was gone. Within hours, the dream of seizing Richmond evaporated. Instead of freedom, Gabriel's followers faced pursuit. The storm had undone months of preparation, and betrayal had sealed the fate of the rebellion. Still, Gabriel did not surrender immediately. He slipped into hiding, moving through swamps and forests, seeking refuge among allies. His determination did not waver, but the noose of surveillance tightened. The rebellion that almost was now became a hunt. The night of August 30th became infamous, not as the dawn of freedom, but as the storm that washed away revolution. For some, it was a tragedy. For others, proof that fate itself sided with Virginia's rulers. But for history, it was a reminder of how fragile courage can be when faced with rain, fear, and betrayal. After the storm shattered his plans, Gabriel found himself caught between 2 worlds, the dream of freedom he had forged and the nightmare of capture that now hunted him. Virginia's rulers, gripped by panic, unleashed their forces to track down the man they called the mastermind of insurrection. The rebellion had not erupted, but the mere whisper of its possibility was enough to terrify the elite. To them, Gabriel was more dangerous than any musket. He represented the unspoken truth that those they enslaved were not passive, but plotting. That knowledge was enough to justify swift and merciless action. Militias swept the countryside, roads were patrolled, plantations searched, and cabins interrogated. Men suspected of joining Gabriel were rounded up, questioned, and jailed. Fear spread on both sides. Enslavers feared another Haiti. The enslaved feared the lash, the gallows, or worse. Gabriel, meanwhile, vanished into the swamps and woods. The landscape became his shield. Dense forests, marshy ground, and hidden paths offered temporary refuge. He moved silently, guided by instinct and by allies who risked their lives to shelter him. For days, he evaded capture. Rumors placed him in Richmond, then in Henrico County, then beyond. Each whisper fueled the sense of dread among whites, who imagined Gabriel as a ghost slipping through shadows, ready to strike again. The reality was harsher. Gabriel was not an untouchable phantom. He was a man on the run, weary, hunted, and betrayed by circumstance. Still, he refused to surrender. His survival itself was defiance, proof that even in failure, the spirit of rebellion endured. But betrayal, not force, would bring his downfall. A fellow enslaved man, perhaps driven by fear or the promise of reward, revealed Gabriel's hiding place. In a society built on coercion, loyalty was fragile, and betrayal was always a weapon waiting to be used. Captured at last, Gabriel was dragged back to Richmond. Shackled and guarded, he was paraded as both a warning and a trophy. To the authorities, his capture was proof of their control. To his followers, it was a wound that cut deep but did not erase the dream. The trials began almost immediately. Gabriel was accused of plotting insurrection, of gathering men, of planning to overthrow the city. The evidence was clear enough, not in documents, but in the terror that had already swept through Virginia's ruling class. Fear became proof, and proof became conviction. Witnesses, some coerced, testified against him. Names were spoken, numbers exaggerated, details twisted. The courts did not seek truth. They sought closure. Gabriel was guilty before he entered the courtroom. His fate was sealed long before the gavel struck. Yet even in chains, Gabriel carried himself with dignity. Accounts suggest he refused to beg for mercy, refused to betray others, and faced his accusers with calm resolve. If his rebellion had failed, his spirit had not. He would not break. By October 1800, the verdict was delivered: death by hanging. Gabriel would join the long list of those executed for daring to imagine liberty. But unlike others, his story would not fade into silence. The hunt had ended. Gabriel's body would hang, but his name would linger, passed in whispers, remembered in defiance, preserved in history. For Virginia's rulers, his death was meant to erase rebellion. In truth, it ensured he would live forever as its symbol. The gallows have always been more than wood and rope. They are theaters of power, stages where rulers remind the ruled of their place. In October 1800, Richmond prepared such a stage for Gabriel, the blacksmith who dared to dream beyond his chains. Crowds gathered to witness the spectacle. Some came out of fear, others out of curiosity, and many because executions were treated as public events, a grotesque kind of entertainment. But for Gabriel's followers, the scene was no show. It was a funeral for hope. The authorities dressed the execution in the language of justice. They claimed Gabriel's death would preserve order, that it was necessary for safety. In truth, it was less about law and more about fear. His hanging was a warning carved into the sky. Gabriel was brought forward in chains. Eyewitnesses later described his composure: calm, dignified, unbroken. He did not weep, did not plead, did not give his captors the satisfaction of seeing despair. If slavery was meant to strip dignity, Gabriel reclaimed it in his final moments. He spoke little, but his silence carried meaning. Unlike others who confessed or begged to spare their families, Gabriel refused to betray his comrades. He chose death over dishonor, martyrdom over submission. The rope could choke his body, but not his spirit. As the noose was placed around his neck, the crowd fell silent. The spectacle became something else, an uncomfortable reminder that the man they were about to kill was not a monster, but a craftsman, a leader, a man who wanted freedom. The executioners killed him, but in doing so, they revealed their own cruelty. The trapdoor fell, the rope snapped taut, and Gabriel, the blacksmith of rebellion, swung lifeless against the Virginia sky. His body stilled, but his story was only beginning. The authorities saw a criminal. History would see a martyr. Executions are meant to erase, but often they do the opposite. Gabriel's death transformed him from a conspirator into a symbol. His name joined the long line of those who dared to resist, from Moses of Scripture to Toussaint Louverture of Haiti. In the weeks that followed, more executions claimed dozens of others accused of joining the conspiracy. Each body that swung from the gallows was another attempt to crush rebellion. Yet together, they etched into memory the scale of defiance, even in defeat. The irony was sharp. Virginia claimed to protect liberty while hanging men who demanded it. The hypocrisy was so blatant it could not be hidden, even under sermons and proclamations. The gallows became not a symbol of justice, but of America's contradictions. Gabriel's last stand was not in Richmond streets with weapons drawn. It was at the scaffold where he refused to bow. His execution proved what Virginia feared most, that enslaved people were not passive, but bold enough to risk everything for freedom. And so Gabriel's body was buried, his rebellion extinguished. But the fire he lit smoldered in memory, ready to flare again in the next generation. His last stand was not the end. It was a beginning written in defiance. Gabriel's execution did not close the book on his rebellion. It opened a new chapter of fear. Across Virginia, the white elite trembled at the thought that their enslaved laborers might still rise. The rebellion may have failed, but the mere fact that it was planned left scars on the psyche of the South. Plantation owners whispered about betrayal from within. Could they trust the men who worked their fields? Could they sleep safely in their mansions, knowing that the same hands that tilled their crops had once sharpened weapons for insurrection? Every gesture, every glance from the enslaved now carried new weight. In Richmond, fear bred repression. Laws tightened almost immediately. The state legislature moved to choke off every avenue of resistance. Free black people, like Gabriel once was, were targeted with new restrictions, their movements watched, their gatherings banned, their very existence treated as a threat. Assemblies of the enslaved were outlawed. Churches came under scrutiny. What had once been places of worship now looked to the authorities like potential headquarters for rebellion. Preachers were silenced, congregations broken apart, sermons monitored, even the language of faith was policed. Literacy became another battlefield. Laws against teaching the enslaved to read were strengthened. The idea that knowledge could fuel insurrection terrified the elite. If Gabriel could read the Bible and see freedom in its verses, who knew how many others might follow? To enslavers, letters became weapons. Militias drilled more often, patrolling with muskets gleaming in the sun. They staged their own performances of power, hoping to intimidate communities into submission. But in truth, the more they paraded, the more they revealed their anxiety. A society that trusts itself does not march with guns at every corner. For enslaved people, the aftermath was suffocating. Families faced harsher oversight, night patrols invaded cabins, conversations were cut short by suspicion. The air grew thick with surveillance, as though every word might be overheard, every gesture punished. Those accused of joining Gabriel faced brutal consequences. Some were executed, others transported or sold to distant plantations as punishment. The aim was not only to punish individuals, but to scatter communities, to uproot the networks of trust that had allowed the rebellion to form. Even free black artisans and workers, men who had lived within the narrow freedoms allowed by Virginia, now found themselves targeted. Gabriel's status as a literate craftsman had shown the danger of independence. The authorities concluded that free black people were a liability, not an asset. Newspapers added fuel to the fire. Editorials framed Gabriel's plot as proof of black ingratitude and white vigilance. They painted the rebellion as an existential threat, a near apocalypse narrowly avoided. Fear sold papers, and papers spread panic. Yet for all the repression, the fear never truly subsided. Gabriel's rebellion had proven something too powerful to be erased, that slavery was not stability, but volatility. The system that enslavers claimed was natural and secure had been revealed as fragile, trembling beneath the weight of its own injustice. The aftermath hardened Virginia into a fortress of chains and laws, but no fortress is unbreakable. Beneath the surface, the memory of Gabriel's plan smoldered like hidden embers, and embers, even buried, can spark fire again. History has a habit of burying rebels quickly, but memory has an even greater habit of keeping them alive. Gabriel's rebellion, though crushed in 1800, refused to fade. His story slipped into whispers, songs, and sermons, carried forward by those who understood that even failure could be a seed of future victory. Among enslaved communities, Gabriel became both cautionary tale and quiet inspiration. Parents warned children of the danger of speaking too boldly, yet in the same breath, they honored Gabriel's courage. His name was spoken carefully, often at night, as a reminder that resistance was possible, even when costly. Spirituals carried echoes of his defiance. Songs about crossing rivers, storms, and deliverance were not just hymns, they were veiled references to freedom struggles. Though his rebellion failed, Gabriel's spirit lived in music, coded words vibrating with both grief and hope. For Virginia's white elite, Gabriel's ghost was harder to silence. His name was rarely spoken openly, but the fear lingered. Every new rumor of uprising, every whisper of unrest, reminded them of the blacksmith who once dared to dream of overthrowing Richmond. His absence haunted them more than his presence ever had. In the North, Gabriel's story took on a different life. Abolitionists seized on it as proof of slavery's violence and hypocrisy. Pamphlets retold his plot not as criminal conspiracy, but as evidence that enslaved men longed for the liberty America claimed to cherish. His memory became propaganda for freedom. Historians of the time often dismissed him, preferring to frame his plot as exaggerated paranoia. Yet, even in their dismissal, they revealed the cracks in the system. Why invent paranoia if there was no reason to fear? The very act of denying Gabriel's seriousness proved his lasting impact. Later generations rediscovered him. During the Civil War, soldiers heard whispers of Gabriel as one of the forerunners of resistance. For abolitionists, his story was folded into a broader narrative, proof that enslaved people had always resisted, that freedom was not a gift bestowed but a prize fought for. By the civil rights movement of the 20th century, Gabriel was reclaimed fully. Activists invoked his name as a symbol of black resistance long before emancipation. His dream of universal freedom connected him to a wider struggle that spanned centuries. Monuments and memorials, though rare, began to appear. Streets, schools, and plaques bore his name. Where Virginia had once silenced him, new generations sought to honor him. In this way, his rebellion was never truly lost. It was simply delayed in recognition. The legacy of Gabriel is not just about what he failed to achieve, but about what he revealed. That slavery was never passive, that enslaved people were thinkers, organizers, and visionaries. His rebellion shattered the lie that bondage erased ambition. Myth wrapped itself around Gabriel, too. Some exaggerated the size of his army, painting him as a general commanding thousands. Others portrayed him as almost saintly, a man chosen by destiny. Reality and legend blurred, but the effect was the same. Gabriel became immortal in memory. For America, the echoes of Gabriel remain uncomfortable. He forces the nation to confront its contradictions, to remember that while Jefferson wrote of equality in 1776, Gabriel swung from the gallows in 1800 for demanding the same. His ghost is a mirror held to liberty's hypocrisy. And so Gabriel's rebellion echoes still, not in the clanging of swords or the roar of muskets, but in the persistence of memory. Each retelling, each monument, each whisper ensures that the blacksmith who dreamed of freedom is never truly silenced. Gabriel's rebellion may have failed in 1800, but the lessons it left behind remain urgent. His story is not locked in the past. It is a reminder, a challenge, and a warning that still speaks to our present. The first lesson is about the fragility of hypocrisy. Virginia's leaders prided themselves on liberty, quoting Jefferson and Madison while enslaving thousands. Gabriel exposed this contradiction with his very existence. His demand for freedom was not foreign. It was simply America's own ideals, spoken by the wrong voice. The second lesson is about the power of imagination. Gabriel never fired a shot, yet he terrified one of the richest states in the South. Why? Because he dared to imagine a world without chains. Imagination, when shared among the oppressed, becomes a force stronger than weapons. The third lesson is about fear as a tool of control. After the rebellion collapsed, Virginia responded with harsher laws, tighter restrictions, and more surveillance. The system survived, but only by admitting its own weakness. A society that lives in fear of its workers, its neighbors, its very foundation, is a society on borrowed time. The fourth lesson is about resistance in all forms. Gabriel's plot was dramatic, but everyday defiance, songs, prayers, teaching letters in secret, refusing to break, was just as revolutionary. His story reminds us that rebellion is not only found in armies, but also in persistence. The fifth lesson is about memory as resistance. Authorities tried to bury Gabriel, erase his story, and silence his name. Yet memory kept him alive. To remember the oppressed is to deny their erasure. To forget is to betray them all over again. For America today, Gabriel's rebellion forces hard questions. Do we still silence uncomfortable truths? Do we honor ideals while betraying them in practice? His story is not only about slavery, it is about every system where power silences justice. Gabriel's life also offers inspiration. He was a craftsman, not a general, a man of tools, not titles. Yet he dared to believe that freedom was possible. His example tells us that ordinary people, when united by conviction, can challenge empires. Finally, Gabriel teaches us that defeat is not the end. Though his rebellion failed, his legacy fueled abolition, inspired generations, and remains part of America's unfinished reckoning with its past. Failure in action became success in memory. The blacksmith who planned revolution reminds us that freedom is always forged in struggle. It is hammered into being, blow by blow, spark by spark, until even the strongest chains begin to break. That was Gabriel's lesson in 1800, and it remains true today. Gabriel's rebellion is not just a story from 1800. It is a mirror reflecting the cracks in America's foundations. His gallows may have silenced his voice, but history carries his words louder than the ropes that once bound him. What he represents is not defeat, but persistence. Even when storms ruined his plans, even when betrayal doomed his uprising, his dream did not die. It lived on in whispers, in abolitionist speeches, in the memories of the enslaved, and now, in us retelling his story. When we remember Gabriel, we refuse to let injustice hide in silence. We remind ourselves that freedom was never handed down from above. It was demanded, fought for, and dreamed into being by those society tried to erase. The blacksmith's hammer still echoes, not on iron, but in history itself. Every spark he struck reminds us that liberty without equality is a lie, and justice without memory is a shadow. Gabriel's struggle is our reminder to face the contradictions of today with the courage he carried in 1800. So, as we close this chapter of dark history, let us not forget Gabriel's name. Let us say it, share it, and honor it, not as a footnote, but as a warning and a beacon. His rebellion was crushed, but his dream endures. If this story moved you, don't let it fade. Share it with others. Keep Gabriel's memory alive. And if you want to uncover more untold stories from the shadows of history, make sure to like this video, subscribe to the channel, and hit the bell so you never miss the next chapter of dark history. Together, we resist forgetting. Together, we keep memory alive.